So today's lesson is on the president, and this unit will be the presidency, the executive branch, basically. So first I want to start with the roles and responsibilities of the president. The president is the chief executive of the executive department. And the president is the chief of state, meaning kind of the symbolic leader of the nation. The president has powers over agenda setting, managing the economy. The president is the chief diplomat for the U.S., the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and the leader of his political party. I'll go over each of those in a little bit more detail. So as chief executive, the president oversees a bureaucracy of 4 million federal employees. The Constitution obligates the president to see that the laws be faithfully executed. And you might say that's the chief job of the president, right? To carry out the laws, to execute the laws. To help him or her do this, the president appoints secretaries of the cabinet. There are 15 departments that are cabinet level departments of the executive branch of the government, and he appoints those department heads with Senate approval. And the president appoints the heads of other federal government agencies as well. And so they carry out his policies, his plans in the government. So as chief of state, the president is the symbol of the United States, right? The chief representative of the United States. So the president has responsibilities making patriotic speeches, entertaining foreign leaders, awarding medals to outstanding members of the community, and promoting charitable and worthy causes. Let me ask you a question, just for comparison's sake. Do you know who the chief of state is for the United Kingdom? Great Britain. Anyone know? I bet you do. I bet you've seen it in the news. You've forgotten that you know, but I think you know. I'll give you a hint. The former chief of state for the United Kingdom died just a few weeks ago.
Queen Elizabeth?
Yes, very good, yes. Queen Elizabeth was the chief of state for many years, right, going all the way back to World War II. She died, and now her son Charles is the king of the United Kingdom. And the reason I pointed that out is, for England, that's a basically ceremonial role, right? They do ceremonies. They represent the country, but they don't have real policy-making power. Here, the president does have real policy-making power, but also is the ceremonial representative of the United States. So he kind of has both jobs together. So another important role is in agenda setting. And one way that the president defines the agenda is he gives an annual State of the Union message. This is every January or so, January, February, the president gives a speech to Congress. And this speech sets forth an agenda. It basically has a list of proposals. Also, the president submits a budget proposal to Congress every year. And then the president can lobby Congress members to support his proposals and his budget. The president can threaten to veto whatever the Congress passes and can use that threat to help try to get his own agenda passed instead. Another thing that the president can do, and this has become, I think, increasingly popular, is when the president signs a law, they attach to it a signing statement. And this just explains how the president interprets the law that he just signed and how he plans to execute it. And it's not really a part of the law, but it helps influence how people perceive the law that he just signed. So the president's the manager of the economy. And one of the most important things the president does to do that is appoint the chairperson of the Federal Reserve Board. Here you see Reagan with, I think this was Paul Volcker, who he actually inherited. It was Carter, I think, who appointed him, but he was the chair of the board, of the Federal Reserve Board, during early in Reagan's presidency. So the president indirectly influences the economy that way. The president also can influence tariff and tax policy, and can establish a regulatory environment. What I mean by that is the federal agencies issue tons and tons and tons of regulations that have the effect of laws, And so the president can influence what kind of regulations they issue, how many regulations they issue, and so that has a big economic effect and a big policy effect. The president is the chief diplomat. Here you see a picture, famous picture, well, a picture of a famous meeting, Nixon's secret trip to China. Nixon didn't want to tell anybody he was going. He just sort of appeared in China one day and met with Mao Zedong, the leader of China. And up until then, the United States and China had never officially acknowledged each other or had any diplomatic interaction with each other. So this was a major diplomatic breakthrough. So the president creates and administers foreign policy, negotiates treaties with other countries, but the treaties then have to be ratified by Congress. The president can form executive agreements with other countries. These are international agreements between the U.S. and other nations, but they're not subject to Senate approval, and so they're not treaties. And you might think, well, what's the point of making a treaty if you can just make an executive agreement? Well, I'll give you an example. Several years ago, President Obama made an executive agreement with Iran. And there was a lot of controversy over every aspect of it, whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, I won't get into. But some people thought it should have been a treaty, right? It should have had Senate approval because it was a very important issue about nuclear weapons and all that sort of thing. Well, they didn't want to try to get Senate approval because the Senate would not have approved of it. So it was an executive agreement. What's the weakness of the executive agreement? The next president who came in, President Trump, didn't like this agreement at all. And so he just tore it up because it doesn't have Senate. And when the Senate approves of a treaty, it's now law. And the next president down the line can't just tear it up because he doesn't like it. So, but the power to make executive agreements with other countries is an important power. The president appoints diplomats and ambassadors to other nations and hosts state dinners and receives the ambassadors of other nations. The president is the supreme military commander, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, and the Coast Guard. So the president decides when to send troops into battle, but only Congress can declare war. The president sets military strategy, so the president can hire and fire generals, for example. Now this is the last president we have had who was a general. This is Dwight Eisenhower, and he was the commander of the Allied forces in World War II. The only president that we've ever had who actually led forces into battle or commanded troops in the field was George Washington. But there was no battle. He led troops into the field. There was a rebellion that he was putting down called the Whiskey Rebellion, but the rebels just disappeared when he arrived there with his army of 15,000. So they didn't have to actually fight. But that was the last time that an American president literally led troops into the field in office. The president is the party leader, meaning the symbolic leader for his or her political party. The president selects the national party chair, serves as the party's premier fundraiser, and usually campaigns on behalf of his party's candidates. And sometimes this is a very good thing or a very bad thing. A popular president can help other people in his party get elected. An unpopular president can have a negative effect on his party candidates. So now I want to talk about the president's power to make real policy changes and what the sources of those powers are. So we have expressed and inherent powers, or implied powers, excuse me. So expressed powers are powers that are enumerated in the Constitution. Implied powers are obviously powers that are implied in the Constitution, but not enumerated. We also have, and I guess these would be implied powers, I guess, but we have statutory powers. These are powers that are explicitly granted to presidents by congressional action. So So the source of all the president's powers is constitutional, in a sense. But the Constitution gives express and implied powers. And the Constitution also gives Congress powers, right? And then Congress can give statutory powers to the president. So the Congress can write a law saying the president needs to do X, Y, and Z. Now, the president has some special powers that are implied, and then I'm going to talk about in just a little bit more detail, called executive orders, emergency powers, and executive privilege. I'll write those down. So special powers. Was there a question?
So is it constitutional?
Yes, I explained it awkwardly. So is this the one that's confusing you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I explained it awkwardly. That's my fault. What I meant was, now all powers must come from the Constitution, okay? Either express or implied. The ones that the Constitution grants to the president himself are either express or implied. So it expressly says the president is A, B, and C, or has A, B, and C powers, okay? And then we think the Constitution implies other powers, and that's gonna be these special powers that I'm gonna talk about right now.
Okay.
Down here, the Constitution also grants power to Congress. Does that make sense? The
Okay.
Constitution says Congress has the power to make laws.
Yeah.
Through making laws, Congress can then delegate some powers to the president.
Okay.
So the root of it all is always the Constitution. Now, these are implied constitutional powers, these special powers. The Constitution doesn't specifically mention executive orders, emergency powers, or executive privilege, but we kind of assume that it grants the president those powers as well. So the expressed powers come from Article 2, Sections 2 and 3 of the Constitution, which say that the president will serve as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, appoint the heads of the executive departments, the ambassadors, the Supreme Court justices, pardon crimes, make treaties, give a State of the Union address to Congress, convene the Congress, receive ambassadors, and commission officers of the United States. These are powers that are listed in the Constitution, so they are express. The special presidential powers that I mentioned here, executive orders, emergency powers, executive privilege, we think the Constitution implies that he has those powers, but it doesn't list them by name. So the executive orders are the power to issue orders that have the force of law. Now, if the idea of implied is tricky, think of it this way. We know the president is the commander-in-chief, right? The Constitution says so in plain English. Well, if he's commander-in-chief, doesn't that mean he can give orders to the military? Well, it doesn't say so explicitly, but that makes sense. He wouldn't be any good as commander-in-chief if he couldn't give orders to the military. So executive orders are implied, is the way it works. Now, emergency powers are broad powers exercised during times of national crisis. And that gets a little bit more controversial. Executive privilege is even more controversial, perhaps. This is the right of the chief executive and members of the administration to refuse to disclose confidential conversations or national security information to Congress or the courts. Executive privilege is probably best remembered as the right not to reveal information. The right to keep information secret is executive privilege. Now, that's even more controversial. How does the Constitution imply such a power? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but the argument is that it does. So I want to focus on executive orders for a few minutes, because I think these are really interesting and often controversial ways that presidents influence policy in the United States. And some of the very memorable events in American history have been accompanied by executive orders, or been the result of executive orders. So an executive order is a directive used by the president to manage the operations of the federal government. They are subject to judicial review, so a court can look at them and analyze them and challenge them. And they can be overturned if the orders lack support by a statute or the Constitution. So if the president issues an executive order and it affects me somehow, and I think it's unconstitutional, I think the president doesn't have the authority to issue this order, I can go to court, a federal court, and I can tell the judge, this is unconstitutional because A, B, C, or D. And the court will ask, does the Constitution give the president the authority to do this? Did Congress give the president the authority to do this? And if the answer to both of those questions is no, then it's struck down. It's not constitutional. So executive orders have the force of law. They direct the enforcement of congressional statutes or Supreme Court rulings, or they enforce specific provisions of the Constitution. And the way they affect policy is they create or change the regulatory guidelines or practices of an executive department or agency. So executive orders are usually the president telling an agency of the government, do this or don't do that. Only the president can issue executive orders, the vice president can't. And once they are issued, they remain in force until they are canceled or revoked by future presidents, declared unlawful by a court, or expire on their own terms. Some of them are meant to be temporary. And the president may revoke, modify, or make exceptions from any executive order, whether the order was made by the current president or a predecessor. But we'll see an exception to that in a minute. An interesting exception. So what is the basis for executive orders? The U.S. Supreme Court has said that they all must be either rooted in Article 2 of the Constitution or in a statute passed by Congress. So, to give you a silly example, if President Biden issues an executive order that all elementary school children in Athens, Texas be granted free ice cream, that would almost certainly be unconstitutional because he would have no constitutional or statutory authority to issue such an order. It's a silly example, but just to illustrate the point. So, let me go through the history of some interesting and significant orders. Well, orders in general and then some specific ones. So the first executive order was issued by Washington in 1789. It instructed the heads of the federal departments to impress me with a full, precise, and distinct general idea of the affairs of the United States and their fields. So he basically asked his department heads, there were 4 of them, do some research and tell me what's going on in the country. Until the early 1900s, executive orders were mostly unannounced and undocumented and seen only by the agencies to which they were directed. And except for William Henry Harrison, every president of the United States has issued executive orders. The only reason William Henry Harrison didn't issue any is he died about a month into office. Presidents usually are careful to cite their authority. They either cite the specific laws passed by Congress, which give them the authority to issue the order, or they proclaim that it was issued under the authority vested in me by the Constitution. So they always acknowledge it either comes from the Constitution or from Congress, the authority to pass the order. These charts just give you an example of the quantity of executive orders that we've seen historically. Washington, 8. John Adams, 1. In 4 years as president, only 1 order. Jefferson, 4. So a couple of dozen at the most. William Henry Harrison, he died too quickly. Franklin Pierce is the leader with 35 executive orders. He was only president for 1 term, 4 years. But he issued 35 executive orders in that term, and that makes him kind of the winner before the Civil War, the most prolific issuer of executive orders. After the Civil War, the issuance of executive orders becomes more and more common. And we see 2 guys really stand out. Theodore Roosevelt, pictured here, issued over 1,000, which was almost 5 times as much as anybody had issued before him. So he used the executive order a lot to get stuff done in government. And then his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, even more, 3,721, which is the number 1 quantity by far of American presidents. And of course, Roosevelt II was in office for 12 years, so that partially explains why he issued so many. Since World War II, actually my stats here are a little out of date. Biden has issued more than 85 by now. I don't know exactly how many more, but a little bit more than 85. But Harry Truman, 907. That's from 1945 to 1953 is when he left office. So over about an 8-year period, he issued 907 executive orders, and that makes him the leader after World War II. So who are the presidents who've issued the most executive orders? I put these in chronological order. So the leaders are Roosevelt, Wilson, Coolidge, Hoover, Franklin, Roosevelt, and Truman. And Roosevelt has issued more than any other president. Now, this is sometimes controversial. People sometimes think of this as governing by decree, right? And think of it as less democratic than governing directly through a statute. But remember, the presidents always defend it as only issuing orders that the statutes gave them the power to issue in the first place. Now, some of the more interesting and important executive orders in American history. The first one that obviously stands out, hugely interesting and important, the Emancipation Proclamation. It was issued in 1862, and it said that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of the state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. So what does this mean? It sets free all of those slaves who were in parts of the Confederacy still rebelling against the United States government. It didn't set free all slaves, and it did not end slavery itself, which still remained legal, but it set free those slaves who were in areas of rebellion. How did he get the authority constitutionally to issue this? Well, his argument would have been that as commander-in-chief of the military, he had the authority. And this was a military measure, right, to help end the war. In 1933, this is during the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102, forbidding the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. It was made under the authority of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, as amended by the Emergency Banking Act in March 1933. And this order required all persons to deliver on or before May 1, 1933, all but a small amount of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates owned by them to the Federal Reserve. So this is an important historical moment in our economy and how our political economy where we stopped using gold coins as money, or towards the end of using them. This is one of the most infamous orders in history. This was also issued by Franklin Roosevelt in 1942, and it authorized the Secretary of War to prescribe certain areas as military zones, clearing the way for the incarceration of nearly all 123 Japanese Americans living in those areas during the war. 2/3 of them were U.S. citizens, born and raised in the United States, and the constitutionality of this order was challenged by this man, Korematsu. He took the case all the way to the Supreme Court and lost. The Supreme Court upheld the order as justified by military necessity. So I guess it was Frank Roosevelt's powers as commander-in-chief of the military, the Supreme Court said justified this order. Korematsu, of course, said this order deprived him of his Fifth Amendment rights to due process. He was ordered to move to this camp, basically, but he had not been convicted of any crime, right, of espionage or treason or anything like that. This is an order that was overturned by the Supreme Court. This order, 10-340, was issued by President Harry Truman, and it placed all of the United States steel mills under federal control. The reason it did is there was a big conflict going on, a looming strike between steel workers and the owners of the steel mills. And Truman said he was worried about the production of steel, which was necessary for the Korean War, which was ongoing. And so he ordered the U.S. Army, he issued an executive order instructing the U.S. Army to take over the steel mills and run them, basically. And the Supreme Court said that this attempted to make law rather than to clarify or to further a law put forth by the Congress or the Constitution. In other words, the Supreme Court said you don't have the authority to do this. Congress didn't give it to you, and the Constitution didn't either, and so they struck this down. Another executive order that Truman issued was upheld. I don't know if it was even challenged, but it was clearly an order he had the authority to give. Executive Order 9981 was issued in 1948, and it said, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." So what does this do? This is the order in 1948 that integrated the armed forces. And does Truman have the authority to do that? Surely he does, because he is the commander-in-chief. So the armed forces are his job, right? His responsibility. Now I want to jump into recent history to give you a couple of examples of recent orders that have been very controversial, so you can see how whether you like these orders or not is your opinion, just so you can see how it works, how the controversy works, and how they end up being disputed in federal courts. So deferred action for childhood arrivals was the equivalent of an executive order, better known as DACA. This was an executive branch memorandum announced by President Obama in 2012. It created a new immigration policy that allowed some individuals with unlawful presence in the United States after being brought to the country as children to receive a renewable 2-year period of deferred action from deportation and become eligible for an employment authorization document or a work permit. And to be eligible for the program, the recipients could not have had felonies or serious misdemeanors on their records, and this program, this deferred action, did not produce a path to citizenship for recipients. Now, what's controversial about this is, did the president have the constitutional authority to issue this order? The people who think he did would say he is just implementing congressional policy. He's just implementing the law. And he has the authority to do that because it's his job to execute the laws of the United States. The people who thought he was exceeding his authority said, no, he's making new law. Right? He is changing the law. And only Congress can do that. And that was the focus of the disagreement. Now, DAPA came along a couple of years later. So in 2014, President Obama announced his intention to expand DACA to cover additional undocumented immigrants. This would make aliens who lacked criminal histories the lowest priority for removal and grant deferred action to illegal immigrants who were the parents of a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident. Now, DAPA, combined with DACA, would have delayed the deportation of about half of the 11 million undocumented aliens in the United States. 2 weeks after the president issued this order, Texas and 26 other states sued to block it in federal court. And eventually it was blocked by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2016 in a case called United States versus Texas. DAPA, not DACA. The original one was not blocked. Now, President Trump, when he took office, announced a plan to phase out DACA. He said that the original order was unconstitutional. In other words, he thought that President Obama didn't have the authority to issue the order. So he said he would end it in 6 months, and he allowed for the 6 months postponement so that Congress could have time to pass legislation in order to protect the undocumented immigrants. Congress did an act. The 6 month time period expired on March 5, 2018. But then 3 U.S. district courts issued an injunction preventing Trump from phasing out DACA. And the reason they said so was that the rescinding of the executive order was arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedure Act. So this the court said that the Trump order rescinding the Obama order violated the Administrative Procedure Act, which apparently lays out rules that have to be followed by the president to annul or rescind a previous president's order. And so they were saying that Trump didn't follow those rules. The Supreme Court ruled against Trump. Chief Justice John Roberts said, "We do not decide whether DACA or its rescission are sound policies. The wisdom of those decisions is none of our concern. We address only whether the agency complied with the procedural requirement that it provide a reasoned explanation for its action." And then in January of 2021, we had a new president, a third president, Joe Biden, and he issued an order reinstating DACA. And so Trump's attempt to rescind it failed completely. So it's back in effect. Give you another example of a court controversy over an executive order. This is in Trump's administration. Executive Order 13769 lowered the number of refugees entered into the U.S., suspended the U.S. refugee admissions program for 120 days, suspended the entry of Syrian refugees immediately, and most controversially, the part that really got people riled up, it directed some cabinet secretaries to suspend the entry of immigrants from those countries who did not meet adjudication standards under U.S. immigration law for 90 days, including exceptions on a case-by-case basis. And the Department of Homeland Security listed these countries as Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. And because these countries were predominantly Muslim, critics called this order the Muslim ban. So what does that mean? Basically, the Trump order said that the Department of Homeland Security had labeled these countries as countries that didn't meet certain standards in terms of being able to tell us who the immigrants were that were coming from them to us. And so immigration from those countries was temporarily suspended. So this ended up in court. A temporary restraining order was issued in the case of Washington versus Trump, stopping this order from going into effect. Trump responded to that order, blocking his earlier executive order, by signing new orders that adjusted parts of the old order. In 2018, so this is the following year, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld Executive Order 13780 and its accompanying travel ban in a 5-4 decision. But in January of 2021, President Joe Biden revoked the order with Presidential Proclamation 10141. So here you see a very recent example of how an executive order can become hugely controversial, end up in federal courts. The court can block the order from going into effect. But even if the president wins in court, which he did eventually in the Supreme Court, the subsequent president can revoke the order himself, and it's as if it never happened. Now, presidents have emergency powers. So the Constitution does not expressly grant the president additional war powers or other powers in times of national emergency. But some think that the Constitution implies these powers because the structural design of the Constitution enables the executive branch to act faster than the legislative branch. Now, Congress passed something in 1976 called the National Emergencies Act. And what this was meant to do was give the president statutory authority to have extra powers in times of emergency. So this law empowers the president to activate special powers during a crisis. It imposes certain procedural formalities in order to invoke those powers. Congress can terminate the emergency declaration, and Congress has delegated at least 136 distinct statutory emergency powers to the president, each available upon the declaration of an emergency. Now, so if you've ever heard in the news, and surely you have, but you probably just never paid any attention to it, you'll see some sort of natural disaster, a hurricane, or a flood, or a storm, and you'll hear on the news that the president has declared a national emergency. What that's about is the president is following this law. And by declaring a national emergency, he's invoking these special powers that Congress gave him, that are temporary and that Congress can revoke at some point, down the road, if they think that he's abusing those powers. Now, executive privilege is another one of those special powers. This is the power of the president and other officials in the executive branch to withhold certain forms of confidential communication from the courts and the legislative branch. The Constitution is silent on the executive power to withhold information from the courts or Congress, so executive privilege isn't mentioned in the Constitution. But presidents have argued that the privilege is rooted in the separation of powers doctrine that divides the power of the U.S. government into legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And when executive privilege is invoked, the courts weigh its applicability by balancing competing interests. So let me give you the gist of executive privilege is that the president has lots and lots of conversations where he receives confidential advice from lawyers, from department heads, from other people in his government. And the president, all from Washington all the way until today, has always argued he needs to be able to keep that advice secret, or people will be afraid to be honest and open with him if they know it's going to be in the newspaper the next day. So that's executive privilege. The president says, I won't turn over certain conversations, whether they're transcripts, whether they're recordings. I won't divulge certain conversations to the press or even to the courts because they're private. And in a famous case, United States versus Nixon, which happened during the Watergate scandal in the 1970s, the Supreme Court basically said that executive privilege isn't absolute. There are limits to it. In this case, the court said that even a president has a legal duty to provide evidence of communications with his aides when the information is relevant to a criminal case. In this case, the criminal case was the break-in of the Watergate apartment complex or office complex, and so the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to turn over tapes of his conversations.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So, can the Supreme Court order the president to turn over those?
Absolutely, yes. Yes,
Even
yes, yes.
though the executive privilege.
What happens is always this. A court will, usually a lower court, federal court, district court, will ask to see memos, transcripts, something that the president has of his communications. And the president will decide whether or not he thinks that's privileged or not. Sometimes he'll just say, sure, fine, here it is. Sometimes he'll say, no, this should stay secret, and they will say, I am exerting executive privilege or asserting executive privilege, and at that point it becomes a lawsuit, and the court tries to balance which is more important in this specific case, whatever criminal trial is ongoing and how much they need the information versus how much does the president need to keep this a secret, and it's kind of a case by case thing. That's a great question. Great question. Okay, so how much power a president has tends to go up and down according to his public approval. And the concept, what you want to know here is the bully pulpit. Theodore Roosevelt talked about this. He may have even invented the term, I don't know, coined it. This is the idea that the president can use his position as a forum to speak out on issues. He can influence public opinion by giving speeches, interviews, things like that, to force people to talk about things that he thinks are important. And if the president has high public approval, he can use that to influence Congress, to pressure Congress to do the things that he wants done. And obviously that depends on the approval ratings, whether they're up or down. Another concept you should know about is the honeymoon period. We used to talk about this a lot. I don't know if we do as much anymore. But traditionally, the best time for a president to get something done is early in the presidency, right off the bat. Because that's when his approval ratings are at their highest, and usually they're only going to go down from there. So during the honeymoon period is when you'll see presidents sometimes try to get their most aggressive, ambitious ideas passed. Let's skip this one. Last, I want to talk to you about this idea. Well, two related ideas. In at least 4 cases, the House of Representatives has decided that a president had abused his powers or committed crimes of such gravity that he needed to be removed from office. And so the House of Representatives voted to impeach the president. So when the House of Representatives votes to impeach, they are formally accusing the president of committing some sort of crime or abuse of power and saying that he needs to be removed from office. Then what you have happen after the House of Representatives votes to impeach is there is a trial in the Senate. And they conduct it like a normal trial. They hear witnesses, they hear testimony, they have a prosecution and a defense, senators acting as the prosecutors and senators acting as the defense attorneys. And at the end, they all vote. And if 2/3 of the senators voting vote to convict the president of whatever the House accused him of, he is convicted, he is guilty, and he is removed from office. That's the only punishment. Well, two things: removed from office and ineligible to serve in future offices in the federal government. So 4 presidents have been impeached. Wait, sorry. Let me rephrase that. There have been 4 impeachments. Andrew Johnson was impeached once. Bill Clinton was impeached once. Donald Trump was impeached twice. Richard Nixon was not impeached. Some people get confused on this one. He resigned before the House could impeach him. He was a day or two away from a vote that the House was going to take to impeach him. He knew he was going to be impeached, and he knew that the Senate was going to vote to convict him. They had already basically decided. And so he went ahead and resigned. So he was not impeached. Johnson, Clinton, and Trump were impeached and acquitted. So in each of those cases, the Senate heard the evidence and decided not to convict. The second of the Trump impeachments was really interesting from just a constitutional standpoint, regardless of the substance of it, whether you think he was guilty or not. In the second impeachment, Trump had already left office, and the new president, Joe Biden, had taken office while they were doing the impeachment proceedings against Trump. So, the Supreme Court justice, who normally is supposed to preside over the impeachment proceedings in the Senate, the trial in the Senate, didn't even show up for the second Trump trial. He seems to have been saying, this is unconstitutional, it's not necessary. The reason I say that, the question was, how do you impeach a president who's already left office? He's gone, he's in Florida, his term's over, there's somebody new. You can't remove him from office because he's already gone. So there was an interesting constitutional question about whether or not the second impeachment was valid or even necessary. And the people who thought it was still valid pointed out, I think, that if he was impeached, even though he was already gone, he would be ineligible for future office. And so there would still be that punishment left. But he was acquitted anyway. Now, this is the last thing I want to talk about. What happens if a president can't serve? Now, obviously, in cases of death, that's happened several times. There have been many times where the president has died. And everybody knows the vice president assumes the presidency. So these are all men who became president because their predecessor died in office. JFK died, and so Johnson became president. FDR died, so Truman became president. Warren Harding died, so Calvin Coolidge became president. And William McKinley died, so Theodore Roosevelt became president. Well, a president could also resign. Richard Nixon resigned, and Gerald Ford became president. What if the president is sick or ill, mentally or physically, and is unable to continue in the office? There's a whole constitutional mechanism spelled out in the 25th Amendment. I won't get into the details of it because it's interesting and boring at the same time. But the president can submit a message to Congress basically saying, I am no longer capable of doing the job. And when they receive that message, his powers are transferred to the vice president. There is also a mechanism, a very complicated mechanism, where the cabinet can decide that the president is no longer capable of doing the job. And then they can relieve him of his powers, and the vice president will assume those duties. That has never happened, but over the last few years, we've occasionally heard some speculation that it should. I guess I'll show you this last chart. Presidential succession. If for some reason the vice president can't take over the job, then this is the list of who's next in order, all the way down to number 18, Secretary of Homeland Security. But in every case where the president has died or resigned, the vice president has been available to serve and has assumed the office of the president. If for some reason the vice president couldn't, the Speaker of the House of Representatives would be next in line, and then so on and so on, all the way down to this. Okay, that's it for today. I'll see you next time.